So we see two things happening: Parliament trying to assert its authority, colonies resisting, and the colonies wind up actually establishing their own governments. That's a story over the next 10 years, 1765 to 1775. Okay. Parliament tries to pass tax laws late 1760s, leads to rioting, and ultimately Parliament does back down, but wants to maintain that it does have the power to govern the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And so the one tax they maintain is the tax on tea. And we don't need to get into great detail about what happens in 1773 with tea, but if we were in Massachusetts in the early 1773, and by the way, what's the big event in 1773 in terms of the history of Massachusetts and its relationship to the British Empire? Okay, December 16th of this year, and every year you can see this reenacted, but you can also see it reenacted every day on Congress Street in Boston. Yes, Julia.
I could be wrong, but is that the same time as the Boston Massacre?
No,
I think I'm wrong.
You are wrong. Haley.
The Boston Tea Party.
Thank you, Boston Tea Party. Jeff, is that what you were going to say, or did you have another answer?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Okay, yeah. So Boston Tea Party, something all of you know about, and I hope if you don't, I invite you to go down to Congress Street and hear the story directly from the horses' mouths. Okay, so you have that episode, but if we were sitting around in Boston in 1773, interested at all in politics, that would be the furthest thing from our minds. The Parliament, when it passed the Tea Act in May of 1773, wasn't really thinking about how Boston was going to react, how the Americans are going to react. And by the way, I do have a standard wrap on this, which I could give you, but that would be distracting. And I know those of you who have taken my class with me before have probably heard it, or you've been to the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum and heard the story. The big issues in early 1773 here in Massachusetts were who should pay judges. And you may think, boy, that's a strange issue. But here's the thing. In 1770, that big event Julia mentioned happened. What was that event again, Julia?
Boston Massacre.
Yes, and you were probably thinking that because I have that on my mug. So it was a subliminal message about the Boston Massacre. Okay. Does anyone recall what happens to the soldiers who were involved in that episode? Jovan?
Didn't they get acquitted?
They were acquitted. Yes, they were acquitted. They were put on trial, acquitted. Okay. And that's an important episode in its own right, which I'm happy to talk more about. But the reaction in Britain to their acquittal was both great relief, but also fear what happens the next time you have someone trying to enforce the law in these colonies, runs afoul of a mob, and winds up shooting someone and then is put on trial. There's a realization that the British officials had dodged, I hesitate to say a bullet with this one, but they had. And so they say, okay, anytime this happens again, we'll have them tried in England. And it will also, as a way of ensuring that the judges, instead of being answerable to the mobs of hooligans running around in places like Boston, instead of being answerable to them, we will pay the judges. Okay, so judges in Massachusetts now paid by the British Crown. But when I say the British Crown, I don't mean the king, I mean the British government. It's just shorthand for the Crown. That's probably what misled many of you to thinking that the Crown was running everything. It's just a nice way of putting it. So this in Massachusetts raises a problem because the Massachusetts Charter says that judges are paid by the Assembly. So that's a way of making sure the judges are answerable to the Assembly and not beholden to some other interest. And so this is an issue in Massachusetts. Who will pay the judges? And almost immediately, the Assembly says judges cannot accept a salary from anyone else. And various local committees will go to the courts and tell the judges, you have to renounce your salary from the crown. And every judge in Massachusetts does say, oh, no, I'm not going to accept this salary from the crown, except one, and that is Judge Peter Oliver. And Peter Oliver is the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Massachusetts, very important judicial official. He had presided at the trial of the soldiers, and he is also the brother-in-law of Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor. Now, the governor, I mentioned last time that Hutchinson's house was ransacked by the mob in 1765. Or if I didn't, ask, I don't know, Trevor or someone else who's taken my class before, because I tell that story repeatedly. Anyway, Oliver says, no, I'm not going to give up this salary because it actually costs me money to be a judge. It's not that pleasant a job. I have to travel all around this province hearing cases, really petty cases. And it, takes away from my business as an iron manufacturer. If the crown wants to give me 200 pounds a year, that doesn't really even cover the expenses I'm losing by taking the job. So anyway, he refuses to renounce. He refuses to refuse his salary. What do you do now if you think judges should not accept a salary from someone else? Yes, Giovanni.
You either arrest him or have him removed from his judgeship.
Okay, how do you arrest a judge?
I would assume you'd get the legislature sends police in to arrest him, or you get another judge to say that, yeah, this person.
Well, you see, I see what you're saying, but here we have a system of laws, and there isn't a law that says if the legislature doesn't like something a judge does or other judges don't, they can arrest him. But you're on the right track with the second option, which is to remove him. And then the question becomes, Paul, do you have an insight into this?
Yeah, I'm assuming the legislator tried to impeach him and get him removed as a justice.
Why would you assume that?
Because I believe at that time, that's what the Massachusetts charter and system of government said, is if officials start acting in ways that are destructive to the Commonwealth, they can be impeached.
That's true. Okay. And so the person who proposes this is John Adams, who's elected to the Assembly in the summer of 1770, the same time he is preparing the case against the British soldiers that is advancing through the courts in Boston. And so Adams elected to the Assembly, and he says Judge Oliver is violating the charter by accepting this salary. Therefore, we can impeach him. And the other members of the Assembly says, well, that's not going to work. Because yes, the Assembly can impeach, but then the governor's council, which functions as an upper house, will hear the case. And the governor's council's presiding officer is Thomas Hutchinson, who's the brother-in-law of this guy. So is Thomas Hutchinson going to go along with this, or is he simply going to say, since the Assembly has never impeached a crown official before, Hutchinson will say, you do not have the power to do this. And that'll be the end of it. And Adams says, well, we have to make the case anyway. It doesn't matter what happens in the council. So what happens is the Assembly does impeach Judge Oliver. And then it gets to the council. And sure enough, the governor says the Assembly doesn't have the power to do this, dismisses the case. Then in a month or two later, Judge Oliver goes out to Worcester to open a session of court. By the way, Judge Oliver later on writes a history of the American Revolution. And according to Judge Oliver, all of the trouble was caused because two people, Samuel Adams and James Otis, absolutely hated Thomas Hutchinson. And they whipped up all of this trouble as a way of getting rid of Thomas Hutchinson, bringing the whole constitutional fabric down around them. And so from Oliver's perspective, from Hutchinson's perspective, the problem was localized in Boston. But then Judge Oliver goes out to Worcester. Group of farmers come in to be seated as jurors. They look over at the presiding judge and they say, you've been impeached by our Assembly. we cannot sit in a court until this matter has been resolved. Now, according to Judge Oliver and Thomas Hutchinson, it had been resolved because it had been dismissed by the council. But according to these ordinary folks out in Worcester, it hadn't been resolved, so they leave. So you have that problem for Hutchinson and Oliver, that you have an idea here about the role of the assembly that they don't share. So that's one of the big burning issues. The other big burning issue is this in early 1773. 1771, 72, relatively calm years, okay? It's why, if you've studied, if you've had the American Revolution kind of taught to you, you know 1770, big event, Boston Massacre, 1773, big event, Boston Tea Party. All of this leads inexorably to a revolution. Doesn't really explain what happens in 1771, 72, and most of 73. But here is something that happened. Because things were relatively calm in 1772, Governor Hutchinson thought it would be a good time to explain to the assembly, when the assembly session opened in 1773, what the role of the Massachusetts Assembly was in the British Empire. And according to Governor Hutchinson, and remember, he is addressing the assembly, their role was limited. They did not govern Massachusetts. Parliament governed Massachusetts as it governed the rest of the empire, and Massachusetts' assembly would either have to acknowledge this and submit to Parliament or declare its independence. He explains this, as I think I might have said, Hutchinson is in another lifetime probably would have been a history professor. Remember, he's writing a 3-volume history of Massachusetts, and he is really good at something history professors often are good at doing. Does anyone know, by the way, what history professors are really good at doing, or sometimes good at doing? And by the way, yes, Kelly.
Maybe telling stories?
Not necessarily telling stories, but lecturing, okay? It's what we do. By the way, this is why you should never vote for a college professor. Yes, we're often really good at talking, which is something that appeals to people when they're voting, but we professors always know we are the only one in the room whose voice matters. And we know you are smart if what you say, what you think agrees with what we have just said. And if for some reason it doesn't, what we do is repeat what we said, but use smaller words and speak more slowly, which is why you should never vote for a college professor, because always knowing we're the smartest person in the room, only one worth listening to. And actually, I have a long list here, I don't keep it on my desk, of college professors who have gone into politics and been complete disasters. So, and it's an inexorable rule. I've never seen one who isn't, because we have a certain smugness too. As you can see, no one else is getting a word in edgewise here. But so Thomas Hutchinson was doing to the Massachusetts Assembly what I'm now doing to you, which is lectured to them for 2 days about their role in the empire. And their role was negligible, and they had to acknowledge this. And also, it's not up to the assembly to determine where they met and when they met. It was up to the governor. At this particular moment, the assembly was meeting in Cambridge because there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston, so it was unsafe. And so, but also the governor wanted the assembly to move out of Boston, because in Boston, every 2 days, they could get a mob up to surround the assembly chamber and intimidate them. Cambridge, a lot safer. In fact, one of the things the governors kept wanting to do was move the assembly out of Boston, so it would not be under the control of Samuel Adams, Ebenezer McIntosh, the Boston mob. So anyway, this is what's happening. Hutchinson gives this long speech explaining their role. How do you think the assembly is going to react to this, by the way? Yes, Professor Hutchinson, you are right. You decide when we meet, where we meet. We really don't govern Massachusetts. We're just kind of here to give advice. Parliament is really running the show. What do you think? Something Professor Hutchinson, by the way, did not ask the assembly what they thought.
They're going to disagree.
They are going to disagree, Brittany. In fact, they, because here they had been sent by their constituents to represent them, not to listen to what the governor says and listen to what Parliament says. But if you're from Framingham or Dorchester or Pittsfield or one of these other towns, your job isn't to do what the empire wants. It's to do what Framingham, Pittsfield, Dorchester has told you to do. And this sets off a challenge to the governor. And what happens next is the assembly writes to their agent in London, and their agent in London is Benjamin Franklin, and says, see if you can get the governor replaced. You know, back in 1768, when the Governor Bernard had suspended the assembly, that's what they had done. They said, we can't get along with this guy, send someone else. So now they tell Benjamin Franklin, send someone else and we'll, you know, because we disagree. By the way, Hutchinson thought when people in London read his lecture, they would say, finally, someone has spoken sense to these rubes. People in London are really not outraged, but shocked, because up till this point, none of these people talking about who governs here had mentioned independence. But now Hutchinson had said, your only choice, submit to the will of Parliament or declare independence. And he did paint a picture to them about what independence would look like. It wouldn't last long, because they would quickly find themselves, instead of being governed by the beneficent British Empire, they'd be governed by the Spanish, the Dutch, or the French Empire. And then they'd see what they were missing by not being part of the British Empire. So no one is thanking Thomas Hutchinson for the pains he took in preparing this long lecture and telling it to the assembly. And so it's real, and they do ask for his recall. So this is what's happening in Boston. And then another story I don't need to get into here. Benjamin Franklin also finds a series of letters Thomas Hutchinson had written to various British officials, speaking very candidly about people in Massachusetts, particularly members of the assembly, who had to admit, he called them, by the way, a Lilliputian assembly. And those of you who have read Gulliver's Travels or even seen the cartoon know what a Lilliputian is. Anyone know what a Lilliputian is? The people of Lilliput in Gulliver's Travels. James is nodding his head. Who are the Lilliputians?
Aren't they like the little tiny people?
Little tiny people. So a Lilliputian assembly. You know, and he also says the next time someone does something, in Rhode Island, they had burned a revenue ship. Next time they do something like that, have a few of them tried at Executioner's Dock in London. That'll calm down the rest. And he also says you can't expect to move 3,000 miles away from England and still enjoy all the rights of Englishmen. And maybe what the British government should do is crush these people a little bit, and then they'll appreciate being part of the empire. Anyway, Benjamin Franklin sends these letters off to Boston. Samuel Adams has the assembly read them, and this pretty much ruins Hutchinson. Let's just take a very brief look at one of my favorite paintings here. And this is the painting of Samuel Adams that you have probably seen. He is the clerk of the assembly, and he is the leader of the Boston town meeting. Really a very, very savvy political operator. Has anyone seen this painting before? Okay, it hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts. There is a copy of it in Faneuil Hall. And here, the face is important. By the way, Copley, when he did these paintings, usually did an elaborate background, because that's what he did as an artist. No real background here. There's a Greek column, which you can barely see. But then the important thing is here. This is at the moment, this is when Governor Hutchinson is saying the Parliament governs Massachusetts, no matter what we've always thought. Times are changing. And here, what really to me is striking about this painting are Adams's hands. Because with this hand, let me see if I can make this work. He is pointing. Anyone know what this is he's pointing to? That is the Massachusetts, yes, Javon.
Well, you sort of started saying, I was going to ask if it was the charter.
It is the charter. That's where the rules come from, okay? The Massachusetts Charter of 1691 that spells out who pays the judges, who decides where the legislature meets, and these other things that Hutchinson said now were up to the governor or the British Crown. No, the charter spells this out, a written document that tells us what the rules are. Different from Parliament, where Parliament makes it up as they go along, and Parliament decides what is constitutional. Here you have a set of rules that we've agreed to. This hand, you can barely see it, and I don't know if I can, I'm sorry, blow it up. Maybe I can't expand it, but you have the instructions from the town of Boston are in this hand. And this hand, it's resting on the minute book. So this is the records of the town meeting in Boston. And in Adams's hand, as a representative from the town of Boston to the assembly, he has been instructed by his constituents. Okay, that's really the importance of this painting, that Adams's power comes from the charter, or the government's power comes from the charter. This is what people have agreed to be governed by. His power comes from the town meeting that has elected him and now has instructed him. You can see how much effort Copley took in painting these hands, very realistic hands. And we think that this painting was done sometime between 1771 and 73. That's from the evidence in Copley's records. He doesn't say, okay, on March 3rd, I got the commission to do. By the way, John Hancock paid for the painting. Samuel Adams never had money for something like this, and Adams didn't believe in frivolity like, paintings. So you have this painting really is the visual representation of what is happening in Boston during this period, during these years, this argument over the Constitution happening in Boston. And you can see it in this painting of Samuel Adams facing off with Governor Hutchinson, pointing to the charter, holding the instructions, showing where power comes from. Okay, so that's this big drama happening here. And then, of course, you have the destruction of the Tea. Parliament passes the Tea Act. No one in Parliament is worried much about what's happening in Massachusetts. And then, of course, the destruction of the tea gets Parliament's attention. And this happens, news of the destruction of the tea comes back to London at about the same time that the hearing Benjamin Franklin has scheduled before the Privy Council takes place. And no one in London, I'm not going to tell you about the Boston Tea Party because it's not that important to us, except as what happens next. And what happens next is Parliament decides they're going to get tough. They pass a series of laws to coerce Massachusetts into not being so rebellious. One is they suspend the charter, okay? And also refuse to allow town meetings. What had happened is the town meetings would happen constantly, and that whatever the town meeting decided would be the law. Well, no more of that. The town can only meet once a year, and the governor has to give them permission. Plus all of the local offices that had been elected by the town meeting, people like tax collectors and sheriffs, no longer would be elected by the town meeting. They'd be chosen by the governor. And the governor doesn't have to call the assembly. Instead, the governor can appoint a dozen or 25 counselors from around the province to help him govern. So no more charter, no more town meetings, no more assembly. And the new governor will be Thomas Gage. Mild-mannered college professor Thomas Hutchinson is out, which is what they wanted. But instead of sending them someone they could get along with, which is what they had hoped for, they send Thomas Gage, who is a general. And Gage is, in fact, the commander of British military forces in North America. Also, Boston Harbor will be shut to all trade until Bostonians pay back the British East India Company for the tea they destroyed. like it's like £1.5 million worth of tea that they had thrown into the harbor, and they have to pay the company back. By the way, it's not the King's tea, the King's ships. It is the East India Company's tea, East India Company ships, and the East India Company, as part of the Tea Act, became partly the property of the members of Parliament. Any questions? Okay, suffice it to say, you have over this 10-year period, Parliament. Yes, Paul.
I just had a quick question as to what these acts were called, because I've always referred to them as the Intolerable Acts, but I know that's not the official title. What was the official title?
That's a very good question, because and it gets to a point about when you name something. Intolerable acts is what they were called here. In Parliament, they were called the Coercive Acts because they were trying to coerce them. And I suppose members of Parliament might have debated that. Why don't we call them an act for the better government of the American provinces? Because who would object to better government anywhere? Call something better something, and people say, oh yeah, that's what I want too. Call it intolerable. Very few members of Parliament, well, maybe they would have. Parliament had lost its patience. So officially call them the Coercive Acts. If you want to show that you're on the right side of history, call them the Intolerable Acts, and just ask yourself why they would have named them that. Boy, these acts are really going to be intolerable once people hear about them. It would be honest, should say that. Okay, now number of things happened here in Massachusetts in response to this. Government shut down. Boston Harbor is closed. Thomas Hutchinson, by the way, leaves on the last ship out. Gage comes in. There's some hope Gage might smooth things over, and Gage doesn't come here to start a war. Gage's wife is an American, and the thinking is, okay, he can talk reason to them. And meanwhile, the assembly is meeting, and again, they're meeting up in Salem because of, again, smallpox in Boston. And one thing they're doing in their meeting, this is in early June, is sending out a call to the other colonial assemblies to have a general Congress of the colonies to talk about what we can do to get us out of this jam. And this is kind of a dicey thing. You can imagine the other colonies might say, those wacky Puritans in Massachusetts have finally gone too far. And now the British government is responding. And if we side with them, does that mean that the Parliament will shut down New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, these other ports? And we don't want that to happen. That's one thing. Now, just another aside, and something I should have mentioned, Samuel Adams, in the years between 1770 and 73, was very busy as the clerk of the Massachusetts Assembly, getting the Assembly to create a committee of correspondence to write to the other assemblies. That is, writing to the Connecticut Assembly saying, hey, why don't you set up a committee of correspondence so we can write to each other? And by the end of 1772, all of the American colonies had committees of correspondence as part of their legislative body. And the members of that committee would likely be people who tended to agree more with Samuel Adams than with Thomas Hutchinson. That is, in each assembly, there are people who said, we really like the British Empire. We want to be part of it. We don't want to disrupt things. So Samuel Adams had helped create these committees to start a communication network among the colonies as part of the official governing body. It's not just a group of pen pals. Also, as clerk of the town meeting, and as one of the real leaders in the town meeting, this, by the way, is why Samuel Adams' statue stands in front of Faneuil Hall, which is where the town meeting happened. He had the Boston town meeting set up a committee of correspondence to write to the other towns officially. And again, the people on the Boston Committee of Correspondence would be people who kind of thought the way Samuel Adams did. And this sets up a communication network among the 180 or so towns of Massachusetts. So, and it's like-minded folks writing officially to other like-minded folks, and also ensures that the way Samuel Adams in the Boston town meeting see things is the word that gets out to Pittsfield and Haverhill and these other places around the province. Very important thing, setting up a communication network. Okay, so this is all in place when the Assembly calls to elect delegates to go to a Continental Congress. A Congress then was a meeting. It wasn't a legislative body. And you'll recall that in 1754, there had been a Congress at Albany to try to make peace with the Iroquois. Then in 1765, there had been a Congress to come up with a protest for the Stamp Act. Now there's a Congress to help us out of this particular jam. And Samuel Adams is one of the guys sent to this Congress, along with John Adams, John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, and Elbridge Gerry. So while they are in the Assembly Hall electing these guys, the governor's secretary, actually the province's secretary, official position. Anyone know who the provincial secretary was in 1774? No reason you would. Guy named Thomas Flucker. Thomas Flucker is trying to get into the chamber so he can tell them the governor suspended the assembly. And what do they do to prevent him from getting in is they lock the door. So Mr. Flucker nails the proclamation suspending the assembly to the door of the assembly chambers. They're inside electing these delegates to go off to Philadelphia. Now, what happens in Massachusetts as this is going on is General Gage has a commission to be the governor, but he finds he really doesn't govern anywhere where he doesn't have British troops. And most of the troops are in Boston. He has them in Salem briefly, then moves them all to Boston. Everywhere else in the province, the governor is being ignored. And instead, real power is in, well, the town meetings are forbidden to meet, but you'll have local committees gathering to decide what should happen in the town. So you have real power shifting to these local committees or the committees of correspondence or committees of safety to make sure law is upheld during this period of could be turmoil. And who is really the governor? It's unclear. And this is something we'll be getting to. Okay. In the fall of 1774, the delegates go to Philadelphia for a Continental Congress. And again, good chance that the other delegates will say, we want to have no part of what Massachusetts is up to. Others say, well, yeah, Massachusetts is being treated badly and maybe we should do something about it. The guys from Massachusetts recognize that they're in a difficult position because they need to get the other colonies to go along with them. And that's not necessarily an easy thing because remember, these guys have not met each other before. And some of them are less anxious that, well, most of them realize how difficult it is going to be to oppose the British Empire. And the thinking is, we disagree with what the British government is doing. On the other hand, the king is what holds us all together. That is, we think Parliament has overstepped its authority. We have our colonial assemblies, and they stand in relation to us the same way Parliament stands in relation to the people of England. Parliament represents them. Our assemblies represent us. What holds us all together as part of the empire? What is it that holds us all together as part of the empire? Or who is it? Yes, Trevor.
The king.
The king, yes. So what we should do is appeal to the king, telling him he's been misled by his ministers, and he will, of course, come to his senses, not wanting to alienate his loyal subjects here. That's one argument. Another argument is this. In the fall of 1774, there is an election in England for Parliament. So if Parliament if the Whigs, that is the opposition party, wins the elections, they will change course and do away with Lord North's foolish policies that are bringing on this war. A couple of the guys who were off in England campaigning for seats in Parliament and saying that they will not be part of a war in America, and they say the British ministry is trying to bring on this war, are William Howe, who is a general, and Charles Cornwallis, who is a general. And they are elected to Parliament as anti-war Whigs. Of course, when the war begins, both being military officers are going to be called to serve in a war they opposed. Suffice it to say, there are different points of view in Parliament about what should happen. And also, I should point out that the Whigs do not win the elections in 1774 for reasons we don't need to get into here. It was not a referendum on America because, to be honest, England isn't taking America that seriously. Or they do see there is some trouble there, but the prospect of these colonies doing something drastic seems remote. Now, during the course of this Congress meeting, I should have mentioned this earlier, here in Massachusetts, different counties come together. Remember, by the way, does anyone know what is the biggest town in Suffolk County, Massachusetts at this time? It still is the biggest town in, yes, Trevor.
Boston.
It is Boston. Javon, were you going to say Boston? Yeah. So Boston is occupied by British troops. Boston can't hold a town meeting because the governor's forbidden it, but the county can have a meeting. And so the county actually meets in Milton, a town just south of Boston that then was in Suffolk County, and they draw up a set of resolves calling on all of the provinces to support Massachusetts in its opposition to Parliament's policies and to not allow any of these taxes to be collected and so on. And Paul Revere carries the Suffolk resolves down to Philadelphia. And on the 11th of September of 1774, the Continental Congress adopts the Suffolk resolves. This is going to be our argument. They also send off a petition to the king. That is, they're calling on all of the colonies to join in opposing British policies, and they appeal to the king, saying, get Lord North and the Parliament to loosen up on us, and we'll remain loyal, faithful subjects. They don't say what happens if Lord North doesn't loosen up. Anyway, and then the Congress says, okay, we've done our job. We will go home. We'll reconvene in May of 1775 to hear whatever the king's answer is to our petition. And so the Congress disperses, and over the winter, a number of things happen as General Gage realizes that in Massachusetts, colonists are stockpiling weapons, and he tries to get the weapons away from them, sometimes with disastrous results. Succeeds in getting the powder house in Somerville. I know I'm getting too much into the detail here, which you probably already know. Doesn't succeed in getting the powder out of the powder house, but then the next day, a mob appears in Cambridge and they want to march into Boston and attack the British forces. Cooler heads prevail, and instead they go and attack the homes of loyalists along Brattle Street, one of whom, another guy named Oliver, was serving on the governor's council. And they essentially force loyalists in Cambridge and other places to move into Boston, where they will be under the protection of General Gage and the British forces. Meanwhile, in the rest of the province, they're stockpiling weapons and doing other things. So anyway, in February of 1775, Parliament is deciding, we've gotten these petitions from this Continental Congress, what gave them the power to have a Continental Congress, and Parliament debates what to do. There's one proposal. How about if we let the colonists just come up with money voluntarily and not try to impose taxes? And that's voted down quite overwhelmingly. And Parliament decides we're going to let Gage use force if necessary to clamp down on this rebellion. So getting that word in April of 1775, Gage sends another expedition out to Concord to gather munitions. They partially succeed in doing that, but more importantly, they succeed in getting the 20,000 men or more from the various militias of New England to chase them back into Boston. So on the 19th of April of 1775, a war breaks out in Lexington and Concord, and then along the route back into Boston. And at the end of the day, General Gage and his 6,000 or 7,000 British soldiers are surrounded in Boston by about 20,000 militia troops. And this is a few weeks before the Continental Congress is going to reconvene. And when Congress does reconvene in May, the word it has is, okay, we've gotten our answer from the Crown, which is they're going to use military force. They're actually going to fight a war against us. So this, of course, changes things. And you see in May of 1775, the Continental Congress meets again, changed circumstances. And this also calls into question not only what is the governing authority in Massachusetts, but what's the governing authority in the other provinces? Because most of them have charters that rely on the Crown for some role. That is, the governor is appointed by the king. But if now we're in a state of rebellion, and in fact, by the end of the summer, the king declares all of the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, why do we have to listen to the government established under the old regime? Massachusetts is maintaining that we want our charter to remain in effect. The assembly now meets in Watertown. The governor, remember, had suspended the assembly. The town meetings elect the same guys who now meet as a provincial congress. Okay, we're not an assembly, but we're existing under the same charter. And we'll simply declare that the office of governor is vacant because we don't recognize General Gage as the governor. It's kind of a complicated story. And it's happening in other places too, as the authority of Crown officials collapses. And then you see in its place something else being created. The Continental Congress had called on the various provinces and towns to set up local committees. That is, they formed an association of these colonies together and then called on local committees to form, which happened. So in Boston, you have a committee of safety and you have committees of safety in other places. Remember, we're adhering to the rule of law that the governor said you can't have a town meeting, but we can have a committee of safety meet, which is essentially the same people who were in the town meeting. So this is what's happening in Massachusetts and in other places as the authority of the royal governments collapses in the wake of the outbreak of the war. And then other governing structures emerge, usually many of the same people who had been involved previously, unless, of course, there were people who wanted to remain loyal to the Crown, because then they have a decision to make. Which side am I on in this? Do I stick with the government that we've always known, or the structure we've known, or with these folks? And then what's the end game? It's not clear what is at stake here. Our hope is that the king will come to his senses, cashier Lord North, and decide that fighting a war isn't really a good thing. Or the idea on the side of General Gage, well, Gage realizes that Gage is a good military mind. And he realizes how difficult it's going to be for the British to win a war in America. But people who are in England think relatively easy thing. You know, these people like to get up and give speeches, but once they've actually seen someone firing at them, they'll change their tune and they'll come to their senses. Each side is hoping the other one will come to its senses, and it's becoming kind of late for that to happen. So that's what's going on here. One more thing to mention, but it's unclear what the long-term goal is. Is it to reconcile with the British Crown, get Parliament to lighten up, or is it independence, and what will that look like? Okay, now I've asked 4 of you, Mitchell, Julia Carvano, Haley Donovan, and Giovanni to prepare on Wednesday to talk about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, John Adams's Thoughts on Government. You know, common sense does change the way people are here are thinking about independence, but he also makes an argument about what kind of a government we should create. So that's one of these books that changes the way people think. And Adams's Thoughts on Government is something else. It's really an idea about how to form a government. Paine has an idea about how to form a government, which he talks about in Common Sense. Adams has an idea about how to form a government, what it should look like. So that's what we'll be talking about next time. But this is a process we're going through. No one in the beginning of 1774, when this trouble is starting, anticipated that 2 years later, we're going to be talking about independence. Or in England, that we're going to have to be talking about how many troops we're going to need to send to America in order to suppress a rebellion. And things change over this time. Even in Congress in November, when the Continental Congress convenes, November of 1775, they learn that the king has declared them all to be in rebellion. And Congress calls on New Hampshire and South Carolina to draw up governments to bring them through this emergency. But how do they do this? What will the government look like? Who should decide what kind of a government it is? And New Hampshire has a provincial Congress, pretty much the same as the old assembly, just as Massachusetts has a provincial Congress that's pretty much the same as the old assembly. And in New Hampshire, the Congress draws up a plan of government. It declares itself to be the House of Representatives. And then from among their own number, they appoint a council. They don't have a governor. South Carolina does much the same thing. That is, it draws up a government. Pretty much the guys in the room say, okay, we will be the assembly now, and we'll do what the old assembly does, and we'll have a council, no governor. But it's unclear how long these structures can last. What gives them legitimacy? That is, what gives the provincial Congress in Massachusetts legitimacy is that they say we're operating under the old charter, and people had accepted government by a charter. But who created this government? I mean, that's really what is unclear. And it's also unclear what gives Congress any real power. Congress is has now decided in May of 1775, it needed to raise an army. Well, does Congress have the power to force people into military service? Does it have the power to tax people to pay for an army? And the answer to both of those questions is no. So people had agreed, we don't want the British to be running the show here or Parliament to be running the show. Had we agreed we want this Continental Congress running the show? You know, the Congress, remember, is chosen by the provincial legislatures. But according to the law, those assemblies have gone out of business because the charter was revoked or because the governor had suspended them. So it gives them the power to elect anyone. And there's another question that's going to come up in each of these places. For example, in Massachusetts, you know, the provincial Congress, this is the body meeting in Watertown or in Concord or other places while Boston is occupied by British forces. It says we're operating under the old charter and we can continue doing things the old charter let the assembly do. For example, raise taxes. But wait a minute, you've said we no longer adhere to the old charter, which was given to us by the king. So if we no longer recognize that, why do we recognize your authority operating under that charter? You know, this might sound like an abstract question, but if you have someone showing up at your door saying, hey, your taxes are due, or you're due for military service, you're probably going to ask these kinds of questions. Because what gives this provincial Congress the power to either force you into military service, where there's a high likelihood you're going to die, not out for battle, but through illness, being captured, plus you're being taken away from your family and your work, or you have to pay taxes to us. You know, these are all very serious questions. among the very serious questions as we're trying to figure out what this whole cause is about, or what this revolution is about. And essentially, the revolution really is about who governs. Okay. Now, I know we have other assignments in the class. Let me just refresh my memory on someone asked about the primary source assignment, which is, when is that coming up? Yes, your topic is actually due according to this tomorrow. Okay. So what you're going to do here, wait, let me ask first, does anyone know what they're going to do as far as the primary source goes? No one does, which means I have the prospect of all of you frantically looking in the next 24 hours to find a topic which might not be as interesting as I thought it would be, or giving you more time to think about what you want to write about. So let me suggest this. I've given on the syllabus a number of primary sources available online. There are other repositories which are open by appointment, the Mass Historical Society being one, or the Massachusetts Archives another. And so what I want you to do over the next week is look in these places to see what kinds of people there are you could write about who might have been involved in this. I've also put online, or on the syllabus with links, a number of other primary source sites. So the Wisconsin Historical Society's massive project on the ratification of the Constitution. The Massachusetts Historical Society has the Adams papers. Most of the early presidential papers and founders papers, so the presidents plus Franklin, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, have their papers digitized, available at Founders online. So what you're going to do is find a primary source in one of these sites, or a topic. All of the debates in the Constitutional Convention, as well as in the state ratifying conventions, are there. And it might be helpful, maybe on Wednesday, depending on how much time we're left after Mitchell, Julia, Haley, and Javon are done with Adams and Payne, to talk more about some of the topics you could look at, sources you could look at to help you, because I don't want to have you in the next 24 hours frantically trying to find something. I know some of you probably have been preparing since birth for this. Others may need a little more time. So why don't we do that? Okay. Yes, Ahmed.
Yeah, Professor, I'm just curious, how many pages do you want approximately?
Well, good question. Short answer is I don't know. I hadn't thought to the end of this yet, because the first part is to find a topic and a source. And so by the end of next month, what I want you to turn in is a note explaining what you're doing. That is, what you have been researching, what you plan to research, as well as what sources you have. And that's probably going to be a couple of pages. And then by the middle of November, you'll turn in a draft of this, okay? And so it is a process. I'll see the drafts in the middle of November. If it's way too long, I'll tell you. If it's way too short, I'll tell you. But see what you can find, okay? I'm not expecting you to write a book. I'm not expecting you to write a paragraph. It's Haley.
Are we only supposed to use primary sources? Like that's it? Or can we use some secondary sources as well?
You may need secondary sources, but the object here is to look at primary sources.
Yeah,
and
mainly primary.
Yeah. Why,
okay.
Did you have something in mind? Was that just a question?
I mean, I was looking at some of the primary sources you have, and I mean, personally, I've never really written a paper just using primary sources, so I think I found it a little difficult, but
well, it is. It's but I'm not expecting you to do a lot of secondary research, but if you need to find more things, you can. I mean, this is something we'll probably talk more about next time, because I think it's a good question.
Okay, and also, do you want us, our group for Wednesday, to budget like 10 minutes at the end of class to talk more about this, or?
Yeah, if you can, that would probably be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for thinking of that. Okay. Let's see, Paul.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so you're going to give us an extension to come up with topics.
Yeah.
When are you thinking? Like
How
next
about
week?
till next? Yeah, why don't we say next week?
All right, so next Monday.
Yeah, yeah.
And then how specific do you want our topics to be? Like, do you want it to be just like a singular primary source document? Do you want us to be like a collection of primary source documents, or just like an overall topic, like, I don't know, the Boston Tea Party, for example?
Yeah, okay, it depends. Again, I'm sorry to be vague. Each one conceivably could be different. I mean, you may decide you were just going to focus on Alexander Hamilton's plan for the bank, or Hamilton versus Jefferson, is a bank constitutional? That argument in which you have two sources here which are arguing with each other about, is the bank constitutional? So that's one topic, using just two sources. Or you could want to do something on the origins of the Second Amendment. What does it mean? In which case you would be looking at the debates on ratification and the two clauses of the Second Amendment, what they mean and where they come from and how this is being debated. In which case you're going to be looking, and these are all indexed, by the way, and on Wednesday I will have prepared the, so I can show you what they look like online, but you can just do a word search in them and you'll find hundreds of references to that, or the issue of slavery, or the role of women in this society that emerges, or relations with Native Americans. That is, these are bigger topics. Or you could do something like an analysis of, say, James Madison's Vices of the Political System. There is one primary source that you could easily, people have written books about each of these topics. You're not expected to. So one problem may be narrowing it. In your research note, you may want to say, in reference to Haley's question, has there been any secondary work done on this? In that case, on Wednesday, I'll talk about how you find the secondary work that's been done on something, because there's often other things written. A lot of it can be distracting to you, but some of it can help you. I mean, here you have this document, but you really don't know what it means. So you may need someone else who has read it to kind of critique it and tell you how it fits into some overall thing. But my real hope is you yourself will be doing this primary work and not simply relying on, what Professor so-and-so said about it, but instead you're looking at it with your own eyes and just trying to analyze it, interpret it. So that's it. I'm not quite sure if that helps or if that just makes it sound a lot more complicated and confusing. Let me just see if I can quickly pull up one of these sources and we can talk briefly about it. The Wisconsin series is a little difficult to find, but let me see if I manage to this time. Okay, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so here we go. And back in the 1980s, it is now a long time ago, the State Historical Society, actually 1976, started this documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. And this is a phenomenal source now in, 30 something volumes. Each volume has, you can see, volume 1, is the records and so on. Then you get into ratification by the states. And as you can see, there are 4 volumes on Massachusetts, 3 on Virginia, 2 on Maryland. And then there are the public and private commentaries. These are 6 volumes that have everything written in newspapers or letters from people that are available about this big debate. This is one of the biggest political debates ever held. And it happens in every one of the states. And it's not just the elite folks who are talking about this. People from all walks of life are debating this, arguing about this in all of these different ways. So you have this massive series, and then you also get into now they're working on the Bill of Rights. Let's just see if we can find this source easily. I find it sometimes difficult. Ah, here we go. So, for example, well, I wonder if we could do a search. Let's try this. Anyone have a topic they might like to research? We can see what we can find. No one does.
Something on Thomas Paine for sure. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, I don't know if he'll come up in here. This is, you know, with Thomas Paine, different subject, but okay, I'll put him in since you asked, okay?
Okay. Oh, you meant for the engine. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, my bad,
Okay.
my bad.
Okay. Okay, so let's, we'll back up then. Anthony, thank you for playing, but Haley, yes.
Maybe the debate on like whether they should include the Bill of Rights in the Constitution.
Okay, let's see what comes up. Okay, so here we see index by states. Okay, let's just see what happens. We'll go here. Actually, I'll back up. I might have hit the wrong button. So here, this takes us to page 616. And okay, so this actually is the Pennsylvania Convention. Yeah, just says it doesn't really tell us much. Let's see, maybe there is something else that would be a better match for that particular term. Let's see what this says. Yeah. Okay, this the Bill of Rights in this context actually means the English Bill of Rights. So you might need to think of a different idea, different way of putting that. Because the absence of a Bill of Rights is actually one of the big issues in this debate. And let me see what this one tells us. Okay. I'm not seeing the words Bill of Rights here, but there could be something else. I'm wondering if we also could think about a specific right that might be within the Bill of Rights. Anyone have a favorite right?
Freedom of religion.
Okay. We'll try religion first. And you can see now 3,686. I wonder if this is something else, because I don't know that the Ismailites and the assassins would actually be in here. So let's see. Let's try freedom of religion. Yeah, somehow we've gotten into everything in the Wisconsin Historical Society. So let's back it up and see if we can go back to our original source. Actually, why don't we do the commentaries and see what we have here? Freedom of, but by the way, in the old days, you would have to go to each individual volume and look at the index. And this is, oh, 0 matches, modify your search. Okay. Try religious liberty. Yeah, we've gotten off of the subject. Okay, well, I am going to leave it to you folks to work on this. And let's see, searching this. I know I've searched it for other things and have found things, so I'm sure you'll be able to find things. But just think about that. You could look at, what are the first 10 amendments and what are the rights there? And you could track one of these down, or a person. Anthony mentioned Thomas Paine. Okay, yeah, and he wrote a lot on all sides of things. So, so what you should be doing over the next week is either thinking about some of these things and how you want to narrow it down. And if you give me a topic that I think is overly broad, I'll tell you that. Or for something I know where there may be sources, I will tell you that. So the object here is for you to find something that is going to interest you enough to spend time researching it and figuring it out. Okay. Yes, Paul.
I was just wondering how you want us to send you the topic. Do you want us to email it to you? Do you want us to submit it on Blackboard? What's preferable to you?
Well, I hesitate to say send it on Blackboard. We'll try Blackboard. I'll try to set up something on Blackboard where you can submit it, okay, under the discussions. And that way you don't have to send it by email. If that doesn't work, yeah, send it by email. But, okay. So I will set something up on Blackboard for you to submit it, and then to submit the other pieces of this. And while we're on the subject, you also have this bibliography due, and the bibliography can be related to this because I want you to do a bibliography on some topic that comes up. So there you could do religious freedom. And here, we'll talk more about this next time, and I will give you some examples. This is one of the real downsides to this, because many of you came into this class knowing very little about the topic generally, and now you're asked to do some original research on this topic you knew nothing about. In the process of doing that, you will learn stuff, but you're also, in many cases, not in a position to know what it is you need to learn. So maybe I'm explaining to you that I really don't know how to do my job, which is to teach you this stuff. And so I should just say, oh, you're doing fine. Or we should make this a two-part class where in one part you actually learn the stuff and then you find out what's interesting for those who don't know what's interesting yet. And we'll give more thought to possible topics. But the bibliography is it's not writing a paper on, say, you wanted to do freedom of religion, but what's been written about it, and find some sources and then briefly say what they are. It's not just a list of sources, but you have to read them to say, okay, so-and-so says religious freedom is great for these reasons. So-and-so hates religious freedom for these reasons, or religious freedom came here, came there. Actually, those guys from Massachusetts who went down to the Continental Congress also had an unwelcome visitor who came to the Continental Congress, and that was the Reverend Isaac Backus, who was a Baptist minister from Middleborough. And Reverend Backus wanted to know how come the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and the Massachusetts Assembly, which kept gassing on about not wanting to be taxed, was taxing Baptists to support the Congregational Church. And the real problem for the Massachusetts delegates is they're suddenly in a place where most people are not Congregationalists. Of course, it makes sense in Massachusetts. Most people are Congregationalists. They vote for this. And people in other places thought these guys from Massachusetts were a bunch of religious fanatics. And here they have a Baptist coming and say, not only are these guys religious fanatics, they tax us to support their religion. And then Congress invites Mr. Backus to say a prayer before them, which really infuriates the guys from Massachusetts. And Robert Treat Paine, who was one of the Massachusetts delegates, when Congress arranges a meeting between the Reverend Backus and them, Robert Treat Paine says, it's not really an issue of principle with you Baptists. You just don't want to have to pay taxes. And Backus says, well, that's exactly what the British Parliament says about you. It's not a matter of principle. You just don't want to pay taxes. And the Congress tells the Massachusetts delegates, go back to Massachusetts and do something to help out the Baptists. And Backus gets to Massachusetts, goes to the Provincial Congress, and they say, when he comes to them, no, Congress said you had to talk to the Assembly. We're not the Assembly. The Assembly's out of business. We're the provincial Congress. We can't help you. Now, it's this kind of thing that goes on. And and in Virginia, it's a more complicated story because they're the Baptists say, okay, if you tax us, and in Virginia, the Baptists are taxed, everyone is taxed to support the Anglicans who become the Episcopalians. How about if we just don't pay taxes at all or don't support the war militarily? It's a complicated story we'll be talking more about. Right now, our time is up, so I am going to let you go. And despite the fact, like Governor Hutchinson, I have several days more of a lecture to deliver to you on your role in things. Actually, your role, according to Hutchinson, would be greater than that of the Massachusetts Assembly. So I will see you on Wednesday, and we will hear from Mitchell, Julia, Haley, and Jovan about Adams and Payne, and I will look forward to that.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Professor.
Take care. Good to see you.
Professor, I actually have a question.
Okay, one second. Let me shut off the recording. Okay.